Hello everyone, today we talk about the French campaign in Egypt and Syria under Napoleon in overlook, really not in utmost detail, but still as an introduction to the topic I've been asked to because I started actually the Austerlitz, the War of the Third Coalition series, so we will continue that, but somebody asked me, why don't you talk about Napoleon in Egypt? Well, okay, let's do this. So, in 1798, as a bit of a context, France had years of war and turmoil behind her, right? It did not lack internal and external enemies, and the goal of a stable and lasting peace appeared possible only at the price of other wars that also were being fought. The same French expedition in Egypt, as we will see now, is part of the War of the Second Coalition that was fought also in Europe with initially, in fact, detrimental results for the French. But the problem was much more complex. It had obviously to do with the broader rivalry between France and Britain for the global control. Naturally, the European internal balance of power, as that we have described also at the beginning of the aforementioned series, considering Austrian ambitions, the Russian ones, and the broader meaning that the revolution that was still essentially alive, and today we talk also about the Napoleonic coup that would bring it, according to the same Bonaparte, to the end of the same, the institution of the consulate that paved the way to the empire and so on. And internally to the same France, of course, problems had remained because, as we will see, the eventual coup would be triggered through the excuse of, however, a consistently present Jacobin threat. It was still pretty much alive as a revolutionary movement. The same France, the same Napoleon, in order to rise to power, had essentially to shrewdly exploit that political direction. We'll see it now also with Egypt and broader ideology that still was, imposed by the French regime. In fact, internally to the same French state, and of course also the threat of a possible royalist, comeback that was definitely backed by the other major Ancien regime powers. The country had been through this pretty harsh wars in which France demonstrated to have, in fact, unlocked through the revolution this new system, the same Napoleon would perfect in a statal sense with an unprecedented amount of military power unleashed that created, in fact, the wars of coalition themselves, but bringing literally human warfare on an unprecedented scale, right, of development that at this point was, exceeding anything that had ever been seen. And in fact, I bear the avatar of someone who was able to realize this and to adapt it to a specific context, but also describing war in its entirety like never humanity had reflected on. And this was definitely caused by the Napoleonic era. Now, the political situation in France rested on a contradiction that was difficult to reconcile, politically and institutionally. The so-called Directory governed the country, right? This was a dictatorial body, essentially made up of 5 directors who had tried, without particular success, to reconcile the various post-revolutionary souls internally. This was very complicated because of the intrinsic contradictions of in fact, laying within the most radical a revolution, and the concept of the revolution itself, frankly, how it had come to be, instead in one of the single most developed countries in the world, and also with needs of political unity, of hierarchy, need of a state, right? So definitely revolution had allowed the next civilizational step to occur, eventually spread it all over the world, and even those countries that eventually were adverse to the system in practice. But it was a step too far, especially from an ideological point of view, and naturally in the hypocrisy of the system itself for how it was standing. Right? Napoleon, in this sense, was hypocritical enough to exploit very well all these contradictions and proclaiming eventually the empire and so on. But it was the right direction. What actually happens in most of those situations where, yes, the system breaks because the ruling class is not able to maintain control anymore, but that doesn't bring at all to an improvement of the average person, if not by the recompaction of power under a more, actually even a more absolutistic power that the contemporary state is, but that can support an expansion from which everybody can benefit, and definitely the world massively and unequivocally and exponentially benefited from, and especially in the 19th century, in the age of colonialism and the fast rise of Western hegemony, albeit at the cost, of course, of the depletion of the sense of tradition, and so to the point when, in moments of stagnation or crisis, the problems really start, because if you expand the power base among those who fundamentally have never been in power and that have not acquired any factual capacity, you can't have improved their, the living conditions, and you can have provided them with rights, but this doesn't mean that they know how to use it, or to use it for the better. But this is another issue, and in general, it's important not to pretend that tradition means simply being reactionary, right? Because reaction very often cuts the legs of the same power booming that tradition is essentially has as the only purpose, right? So modernity is not per se a negative thing. It's negative just because people are unable to afford it as individual persons, not because increasing power and creating what France came up essentially with first in that kind of truly absolute power of the state can be handled, right, in an effective way, as long as you understand what that is. There is a tool, not an end, right? And that's, in fact, the actual problem, that most of the people that today claim that there is something allegedly wrong with the current establishment and look at tradition do not have the palest idea what tradition is, and they're a bunch just of statalist collectivists, both on the right and on the left, that just speaks of their fortunately sinking, and therefore of the prospect of in the future to finally reduce the civic prerogatives of those that fundamentally do not earn them as individuals. And this conflicts with the ideology naturally of the the evangelical point. Anybody has the power if they want, but this is just in potential, right? If this is not expressed, it's as if you have lost a chance, and so you have to pay for the consequences of it, not just being salvaged every time for no reason, right? And that's exactly what statalism, collectivism is really about, and it lays even in the deepest roots of some movements that today think that they're actually anti-statalist or anti-collectivist, and they're actually the purest expression of it, or something like that. I'm talking about ethnopopulism, right, as opposed to socialism or communism, that are basically the same thing. I mean, from a traditional point of view, they completely overlap, and do not have any sensible differences in the political theory and practice, right? And that's the new lie, that the average person that thinks that there is a terrible world order that is oppressing them is essentially the equation of. It's pure superstition and personal inferiority, and a declaration, a willing declaration of such, right? That is completely opposed to any traditional meaning of existence. However, this intrinsic political weakness that the French Revolution had produced, combined with the threats looming over the country from a quite concrete political and strategic point of view, because, of course, all the other powers, aside from the ones that the French had managed to control and partly would lose, however, in the process, were trying to reconquer the same France to the pre-revolutionary regime, as you know. And as a consequence, in a moment of threat, of peril for the same territorial integrity of the country, military leaders had come to national prominence, right? Some authorities who, with their victories, had on several occasions objectively saved the Republic, right? The French army, in this sense, was extraordinary, because not just it had this spirit of moral redemption of the masses, opposed to the Ancien Regime as, in fact, a decadent institution for how it had not been fulfilled by the people, the roles of which they occupied, and the very high French military culture, as easily from a continental point of view, the most advanced, the most, in fact, the most traditional, the most effective, one that was habituated to cope from a much longer time than any other country in Europe, also thanks to the precocious national compaction of France, through, in fact, systemically brutal means, but still pretty effective ones in an imperial sense, since ever, arguably since the Merovingians, had provided, in fact, the French army with the highest standards, properly as a matter of even, I don't know, the French marched more speedily than any other army. They had properly a good sense of the idea of the toughness of land forces as the necessary need on a large scale for such an extended continental frontier like the one France had, and of course very good cadres in the chief of staff, and also very advanced technological culture as well. I mean, think about the reforms of Goribaval, and more in general to the entire French royal military culture, to the same Napoleon education, right, in inside. And this is true for the size that France really was. I mean, Prussia had also topped some qualitative levels, of course, especially of discipline, right, of rigidity, of absolute kind of sacrifice for the conditions, however, of that country, right, that was more compact, smaller than France, and that instead had much more pressuring on a broader scale forces to cope with, having to maintain a global empire just like Britain and so on, and the British, naturally being on an island, had developed dramatically instead their maritime culture, naval culture, as the the greatest one in the world, naturally superior to the French one. So this understanding that the military, right, in France had always had that kind of quality, and that the country depended on such important commanders, generals, in their capacity, had earned to these figures the nation's gratitude, right? The French revolutionary armies had proven, even though being this, again, mass militia that nobody had ever enlisted in such large measures, had actually proven their moral force dramatically, right? And this had saved France in moments, again, in which there were literally 4 open fronts within the same country. And talking about properly the one that was occurring when Napoleon won the siege of Toulon, etc. Right, the usual northeastern frontier, Brittany, other threats also coming from the south. So revolutionary France had passed the test from a political, a military, and social point of view. Except now the system had to be reformed further because it was just a huge one, and so it needed further perfection and consolidation. And for this reason, the generals' popularity and social status had grown enormously, and they had no intention of returning to the ranks of an obedient and especially subordinate instrument of the government, but rather the military also nurtured, and they wouldn't even hide, political ambitions on their own. Thus, the Directory, although it needed generals to keep itself in power, as the French government, was at the same time well aware that in this way it was also cultivating those who planned its dissolution, and they couldn't quite do without them, right? And among these, of course, the most skilled on the battlefield and also the most gifted with political insights was the young Napoleon Bonaparte. Not yet 30 years old, with his victories in Italy in 1797, he had put an end to the War of the First Coalition, temporarily thwarting the threat posed to France by the European rulers, and the Peace of Campoformio, signed in the Friulan town of Campoformido, actually, on October the 18th, 1797, had brought a large piece of Italy as a dowry to France, and also concluded, by the way, the history of the Republic of Venice after 11 centuries, giving most of its territories to the Austrian Empire, and thus granting the Habsburgs a bridgehead in Italy, which would unavoidably, as we've seen also in the strategic premise of the War of the Third Coalition, to new conflicts, right? And this accomplishment, the Italian campaign specifically, had been enormous. First of all, from a strictly military point of view, Napoleon had kicked ass, to say the least. He had come to threaten the same Vienna, and his advance had been stopped in Tyrol. He was wise enough. There were also political connections. This all naturally happened while the French armies were fighting on the Rhine, multiple fronts. And an important part of Italy, the most advanced, by the way, had been secured. This was dramatically important for France, that, as you know from the history of the revolution, had a monstrous debt that was largely repaid with the systematic loot of the enormous Italian cultural heritage from the Renaissance, from those centuries of relative peace that the country, in fact, had lived, and that served, in this sense, to fix, in part, also the French finances. Not everything was settled. There was an enormous issue within the same France, really, for the aforementioned political reasons. Just think about the way the French had treated the Pope, and how important Catholicism was in France, and how Catholic the country was, telling you the truth. So paradoxes about the unescapable religion that we will see also with Napoleon's need in Egypt to cope, for example, with a Muslim country that surely was not open to atheism in any way. So this background, however, had been enough to earn Napoleon this immediate fame and glory. Once one war ended, Napoleon's ambition led him immediately to seek another. Right, his gaze had turned away from Europe now, and that's why we're talking about Egypt and Syria. Now, the French interest in those regions of the Eastern Mediterranean hadn't been new by that point. The idea of making specifically Egypt a French colony was in the air since 1777, when King Louis XVI commissioned the Baron François de Thot with a secret mission to determine its viability, and Baron de Thot's report was positive. Egypt would have, essentially allowed a French presence. The project was abandoned, though, and naturally, taking over the country entailed, as we'll see now, to threaten, importantly, other countries' interests, not just the local Mamluk establishment, the broader Ottoman Empire within which Egypt, however, still was, but especially the British interests that, of course, with Egypt that could ship French forces to India and to the Indian rivals of Britain, would have been a dramatic threat to British global rule. The Egyptian expedition of Napoleon, again, became a topic of study in this context when the foreign minister of France, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, and Napoleon himself, in fact, developed a plan by correspondence while the general was engaged still in the Italian campaign, right? And so was already thinking about the next invasion. And Bonaparte's official proposal reached the Directory early in 1798, so illustrating the feasibility of the plan. So with a detailed strategic document, right? Napoleon suggested essentially that this military enterprise would not only guarantee the protection and development of French commercial interests, but at the same time, much more far-reaching results would be obtained. So as we were saying, Egypt's geographical position made it possible to attack British trade by posing thus a threat to Britain's route to India and to the East in general. And furthermore, in perspective, a French presence in the Middle East opened the possibility of a connection with the ally Tipu Sultan, specifically. That was ruler of Mysore in India. He had been an active adversary of Britain, and as you know, he underwent important military campaigns that were aimed at undermining, in fact, British rule in the subcontinent. So the Directory agreed to the plan in March 1798, although concerned about its scope and costs. It was a huge unknown. In hindsight, it wasn't actually much of a great idea, except, of course, it did make sense by a certain extent. But this seemed more like a broader gamble for the Directory, essentially to get rid of Napoleon, whose ambition was definitely too dangerous, and hoping maybe even that the same expedition would fail, as it would, but unfortunately for them, not staining Napoleon especially military reputation, right? On the contrary, the popular support among the French increased towards the Corsican. And more practically, there was also another consideration, which is essentially almost an anticipation of the Suez Canal. That is to say, the possibility of opening, say, linking the Red Sea to the Mediterranean with this double port fundamentally, that could greatly change, in fact, the international political and strategic balance, had that been carried out by the French. So the other problems we were saying before is that Egypt had nominally been a province of the Ottoman Empire since 1517, but it had a long history of revolts led by the ruling caste of the country, the Mamluks, right, had remained essentially as Ottoman vassals in Egypt, and who kept essentially maintaining de facto power there. Right, I made lots of videos about the Mamluks for medieval warfare. We'll keep talking about them, but you know what it was about, right? It was naturally a much different system now, after almost 3 centuries than the one we have described, but still it maintained lots of properly medieval features that, in fact, are in jarring contrast with the modernity, of course, brought by the French armies. We will see now, and the outcome would be pretty unappealable, let's say, under that point of view. In fact, as a legacy of the medieval past, the Mamluks were essentially an elite of, say, slave soldiers that, as slaves, mostly serfs in practice, had, however, as it happens often in many hierarchies in history, this happened also in Europe, in part in post-Carolingian times, had actually greater power than the same freedom, right? Forcibly snatched from their families at a very young age from all the provinces of the empire, these soldiers would eventually settle down, gentrify, and grow in power. And so the mechanism in part had remained, right? This idea of properly buying slaves from faraway places as far as the Caucasus and beyond. And still, however, selecting some of them for this specific military task that entailed also an important political and social prestige. Naturally, the power was mostly owned by the great beys that were at the head, that were the masters properly of this slave force, and that had fundamentally been ruling the country, very, very often also fighting among each other, as you can imagine, this somewhat still feudal reality. And the masses of peasants who populated Egypt, the Fellahins, lived in those still, in fact, pre-industrial times, at least as far as Egypt was concerned in practice, on a threshold of survival. Right, and the country was backward and in the throes of chaos due to the continuous feuds that divided the Mamluk elites. Right, these countries had not undergone any significant change. It had remained essentially stagnating over the centuries. There was, say, a broader expansion, perhaps of the means, of course, of the also the population increase, and so other phenomena that more or less had been witnessed in the modern world. But politically speaking, just as the Ottoman Empire as a whole, the prospect of modernization and improvement, development, etc., had been thwarted, in fact, early on in the century, and this had brought also to a spiral of repression and obscurantism and inefficiency and stagnation, as opposed to previous times of relative competitivity with the West, right? Now, weeks of feverish and highly secret organizational activity followed, for the French campaign, we were betrayed only by the spasmodic search by Napoleon's close collaborators for every document, geographical map, and memorial concerning Egypt, but also Syria and the Ottoman Empire as a whole. Right? There wouldn't be essentially admissions that this enterprise was to be undertaken until the French army started flowing in the Mediterranean ports, as we will see. But definitely this interest in Egypt and the frenetic preparations for, as we will see now, probably an equipe of cultural experts was very intense, and it would bring essentially, as you know, to the birth of Egyptology as we know it. Right before this time, Egypt was considered just in a kind of westernizing mindset, like, yes, the cradle of civilization in a sense, but the actual knowledge or understanding of the ancient culture especially was somewhat patchy and by an important degree unscientific, right? So many disciplines, branches that we study today as such, were born exactly in this dramatic time between the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, more concrete ways. And this intelligence job, we can call, was to be completed on site thanks to the skills of 167 savants, so wise men, coordinated by the mathematician Gaspard Monge. Intellectuals of various disciplines who were aggregated to the expedition with also an openly ideological objective that was proper of the Enlightenment, that is to say, to spread European progress and revolutionary ideals among the population of Egypt and beyond, and to carry out scientific missions at the same time. Naturally, as we will see, the thing was more complicated than it seemed, but all this preparation was necessary also to frame the same Napoleon within the the wake of Alexander the Great, Caesar, Augustus, so all the great Western conquerors of Egypt, and especially in the Roman sense, as you know, this in fact continuity that the French Revolution pretended to identify in a Rome that is still, in fact, in the way for many people it was described in the Enlightenment. In a way, it was completely different, and fortunately so for Western civilization, because Rome was definitely not essentially a communistic, republican, democratic exasperation of equality or multiculturalism, as unfortunately this is being fabricated exactly from those times. But this is exactly what at least the Jacobins, the French Revolution, had thought. Right, the same French knew that wasn't the case, as we will see. Napoleon himself would frame this entire thing in even there was a paradox, as we will see, because from one side toward these Enlightenment ideals, so the idea that everybody had to learn to adapt to the, for example, the French, indeed the French invasion of Egypt opened to a sort of modernity of countries like Egypt, like even the Middle East, in a broader sense, because of the introduction on a meaningful scale of the most updated printing systems, different ideas also of nationalism, of statelism. The French being there, as we'll see, it would be an ill-fated enterprise, but they showed at least also what modernity really was. I mean, the Mamluk military was annihilated by Western superiority. I mean, there was nothing to do about that. So this thing deeply impressed the locals. Even the Egyptian peasantry understood, paradoxically, the potential that this had in a broader, civic sense, right? So definitely the French invasion was very important. But from one side, Napoleon came as essentially a general of the French Republic, and the French Republic, as we have seen in its dictatorial regime, imposed these ideas essentially of atheism in some form. And so in order to win a Muslim country, this in part had to be mitigated. In fact, Napoleon almost acted as a Muslim, saying, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, because of course as von Clausewitz also teaches beautifully, and every ruler knew, you cannot rule any country ever if you don't have the decisive moral support of the population. And so there was all a kind of blend, a literal pastiche of ideologies of atheism, there were some French that even converted to Islam in the process, but the actual point that emerges, of course, from the entire state of affairs is that naturally the French thought that the Egyptians were just a bunch of savages, and in perspective, really, to the state of advancement of the country compared to France, they definitely weren't that far from the truth, and they actually deeply despised them, and behaved as such, right, as what fundamentally Western moral and cultural superiority really is. Is the properly an imperial ideology that enforces itself in the justification of rule by simple superiority. That is to say, if you give way, I will take, and it will be your fault, not mine, in that regard. And that will sanction the matter. So the thing is much darker than it seems, but at the same time, it's much more instructive and kind of, exemplificative mostly of the disaster of the revolutionary ideology, rather than of kind of a shortcoming of the French. Because, telling the truth, from a military point of view, they still performed well, at least against the locals. Then eventually, when the Anglo-Ottomans arrived, especially with Egypt cut from France, because the Royal Navy controlled the Mediterranean after the Battle of Aboukir, there was no way the French could win. But in that sense, it was still a bigger game than Egypt itself, that for that matter was easily occupied and subjugated. And as you know, as we were hinting at before, from this experience, kind of a much broader understanding of Egyptian history, culture, antiquity, and so on would emerge. The Rosetta Stone was invented during Napoleon's campaign. Eventually, was deciphered by Champollion, but that was just 8 when Napoleon invaded Egypt, and so on. But let's say there we start understanding Egyptian history, and ancient Egyptian history for real, right, historically. And so we owe also to this dramatic expedition that brought to the death of 30,000 French, half by fight and half by illness, and many more Egyptians, Syrians, etc. Part of what, of course, the world is today, for better or for worse. Now, the military component of the expedition consisted of 40,000 of the best soldiers of the army of Italy, and led equally young and resolute officers who we will find among Napoleon's closest collaborators, as you know, earning the marshal's baton: Louis-Alexandre Berthier, Jean Lannes, Joachim Murat, Auguste Marmont. And this force arrived at the ports of embarkation in southern France and in northern central Italy to be packed like sardines on 300 transport ships and just 40 war vessels. setting sail on a journey which, having begun in the last 10 days of May, would last almost a month and a half. There was a famous speech by Napoleon that was saying, you have fought on the Alps, in the plains, in the cities. Now it's your time, just like the Romans did during the Punic Wars, literally, because that was the thing, because they were equated to Roman legionnaires, right? That was the entire point of the French Republic. And now you will have to fight at sea. Eventually, you wouldn't fight. Actually, they're fortunately they managed to cross the Mediterranean, but as you know, the Royal Navy sunk their fleet later. They mostly had to fight in the desert, for that matter. Consider that as average French peasants, they had never seen the sea, and very few had boarded a boat or knew how to swim as a consequence. So we can imagine the consternation with which they faced such terrifying crossing. The most worried, however, were the sailors, because they knew, aside from the impressions again that an average infantry soldier can have from the sea, they actually understand naval issues, and they were aware that such a slow fleet, right, with such a low guard, by the way, and burdened by the enormous load of transport, would have been easy prey of the formidable Royal Navy that was always around, looming. So the destination and the Mamluk enemy were still unknown to most. They, of course, would understand even less what Egypt was before getting there. But the sea immediately presented itself as the most insidious adversary. The wave motion, in fact, caused epidemics of seasickness, aggravated by overcrowding conditions and poor food. And a prophetic sign of what would finally be proved to be the true invincible enemy of the Armée d'Orient, the Army of the East, that would have eventually remained also this was the first one that was created in French army. That is nature, the elements. So the French convoy stopped in Malta just long enough to wrest this important landing place from the Royal Navy. As you know, Malta was the seat of the Knights of St. John, who, however, were importantly depleted. They put up a resistance of some sort, but they were too few, just some thousands. They initially told Napoleon that the French ships could be allowed to enter the port two at a time. It would have taken weeks for the entire French fleet to resupply. So the French decided to attack, and half of the knights were French, so they refused to fight against the same French army, and there was a fight, a fierce resistance, even considering the strategic situation by the side of the order. But eventually the resistance collapsed quite soon. Napoleon took advantage of it by disbanding the order. It was deemed in that kind of revolutionary ideology like, a relic of the past, of superstition, and a symbol of the ancien regime. Considered that, as we will see, the Tsar would become later the Grand Master of the order, also to kind of vindicate in part this event. And Bonaparte could seize the knights' immense treasure, by the way, that had been stored there over the centuries. Now, fortune smiled on the French, especially by sparing them an encounter with the Royal Navy, which would have immediately brought to an end to the mission, because the French fleet had no chances. They were quite lucky, and the Royal Navy was quite near, by the way. It was just, of course, still difficult at the time to track entire fleets and to corner them, but that was an important risk. And consider, just the greater difficulty, the hype, the tension for even launching the expedition and so on, and taking by default into account that there are good chances that the entire expedition can be sunk by the Royal Navy. I mean, this tells you what moral forces really mean when you want to undertake certain enterprises. But we know of which paste Napoleon was made. Now, the landing in Egypt took place on July the 1st near Alexandria. It was chaotic. The broader naval expedition also entailed an attack on Crete. There were actions in Greece, etc. But definitely the most important objective was reaching Egypt and seizing it. The French soldiers, still shocked by seasickness, were immediately sent towards Cairo to attack the Mamluks by surprise. But the officers, also in not exactly brilliant conditions, struggled for a long time before being able to even reunite with their respective units. So everything was rather messy. Alexandria was taken rapidly. In these operations, I think the French didn't even care, for example, to bring in artillery, because the enemy was so unprepared, disorganized, that it was very easy to take them over, just like marching against them. There were intense actions here and there, but the Mamluk resistance was very, very poor at the end of the day, and the French immediately, seized control of these communities with important brutality. They were properly told to respect Islam, right? To be very open about what their purpose there was, at least propagandistically, to again help the true faith, that the Mamluks were a corrupt elite that was not respecting God, and that the French actually respected God even more than the Mamluks. So all these things, but it's obvious that the contact of the average Egyptian with the average French was something very different. So naturally, in the same Egypt, as we were saying before, there was a part of the population who knew perfectly well what, or at least understood that the French were something very different from the Mamluks, that they also brought in very different and even outrageous ideas, including atheism, and so on, but that they could bring a chance of, let's say, social redemption against what was objectively the very corrupt Mamluk hierarchy. From the other side, however, there was exactly this contrast with the French, that were just essentially foreign invaders, and that would use pretty drastic means to bring down any opposition, and that were in fact depicted as atheists, libertines, and just rapacious oppressors of some sort. And so this entire thing was mixed with the entire political international situation, the struggle between France and Britain and the various allies, the Ottomans against the French, and so on. Ottomans that had seen essentially one of their most important provinces invaded. Cairo was, or in fact, the most important city in Egypt, and there was no time to lose, because the Mamluks could mount up an important defense if they had time to organize. So Napoleon's plan was this fast march, and specifically also a pincer movement. One column followed the coast to reach the Nile Delta, and then continued the march along the banks of the Great River, of course. A second one, actually the main one, took the more direct route instead through the desert and this was quite of a journey. In fact, the latter army had the privilege of suffering more cruelly the first offenses inflicted by the hostile nature of Egypt. When you get into in full July, by the way, and in the heart of the desert, right, with an incandescent climate, in sharp sands, with blinding light, and not in a metaphorical sense, the soldiers had to just march, hang at the guy who was in front of them, following the head of the column that would hopefully maintain contact with the rest of the units. Say, without sufficient water, and with a food consisting exclusively of dry biscuits that were easy to store in the ships. That biscuits were kind of the best in terms of volume, say scarcity of volume occupied and amount of calories, but it's not just that thrilling, especially when you're exhausted in such conditions. And it shouldn't be surprising, in fact, that some French soldiers preferred to commit suicide than to march through this literal hell. And while those who still retained a vital spark tried even to mutiny. The encounter with the enemy was paradoxically saving the day, because it was met as a liberation, right? An opportunity to vent the accumulated frustration, anger, hatred, and this would be, in fact, put to full effect. The Mamluks were brave soldiers. Like, you hardly find historically an army that is not able just to get itself killed. So in military conditions, men always get that part of the courage, and the Mamluks were quite proud about their military culture and traditions and so on. They were definitely excellent horsemen, as historically, as these were also essentially of a Turkic or origin of some sort, or at least they lived in still in literally a chivalric equestrian culture that came from Central Asia, from the time of the Ghulams of the Caliphate and so on. However, this meant they were also old-fashioned from a military point of view, and thus they would discover the terrible effectiveness of the orderly volleys of European infantry. On July the 20th, at the Battle of the Pyramids, which led to the conquest of Cairo eventually, 100 Mamluks fell for every French soldier. Right, 29 dead against 3,000, to which must be added other thousands of the fellahin militia that had joined the military professionals. So this gives you a scale properly of the Western military superiority in that context. The Battle of the Pyramids, aside from the picturesque scenario, is just astonishing for the for the ease with which the French, this huge French square that was so large they could fire their own artillery from within it against the incoming 20,000 Mamluks, but there were allegedly other 40,000 that would not intervene because they saw what the consequence would have been, were annihilated. And this is where Napoleon said, soldiers, 40 from the top of the pyramids, 40 centuries of history are watching you. Except that he probably never said this, but something like soldiers, look at the head of the pyramids. Cynically, that's the only thing he said. But then eventually was, just for most episodes, especially in this campaign of Napoleon's deeds, were a bit romanticized. But from a military point of view, the outcome was quite precise. So as soon as this slaughter of Mamluk horsemen came to an end, there was a delegation from the bosses of Cairo that negotiated the the city, the French takeover of the city. And so it was. And that's where the French government fundamentally installed itself, aside from the various detachments, the garrisons that they scattered along the countryside. Now, the Mamluks were essentially wiped out from their center of power, and in fact, most of the campaigns against them would continue in the south, up to Aswan, and so on, and where the French were equally successful. Telling you the truth, like the scenario environmentally, in part also logistically, was pretty bad, but at the same time, the French managed to crush essentially every Mamluk attempt to restore any kind of strategic capacity. The threat, as we will see now, came more from feeling of the population, but let's say at least until the French were militarily unchallenged in Egypt, there was nothing that the populace could do, as they found out themselves quite bloodily. So, from the Muslim East, the French invasion of Egypt meant a rude awakening from the Middle Ages, but also sparked all that series of political, cultural, even scientific mechanisms from which the whole region would benefit from. So, as we've seen from a strictly military point of view, the proud Mamluk cavalry experienced the ordered fire of European musketeers for the first time, paying this terrible price in blood. The French were always much outnumbered, and they faced Mamluk charges, huddling in orderly square formations, solid as rocks, just for the sheer, discipline and volume of fire of the formation. They resisted these fanatically courageous but practically harmless waves of essentially medieval cavalry. If you look at, we made many videos on kind of early modern, also Near Eastern warfare, and you see that there is hardly, aside from, of course, the integration of firearms here and there in a much more sparse way, of course, the Westerners did, but the arms and armor of these men were practically the same. You could see at the end of the Middle Ages. So it's quite interesting, and we have a lot in that sense from that specific past to document and learn from. I don't think there is any need to explain in what the superiority of this of Western tactics consisted in also in a broader sense. It was just properly the organization of these armies that was superior, was supported by much more advanced states, systems, a broader culture that was the subtle one that had emerged, especially in Western Europe, states like France and beyond. And it was becoming pretty standard all over Europe. So whenever Napoleon and his generals succeeded in forcing the Mamluks into battle, the outcome was always the same, no matter how numerous the enemies were. So this is an unappealable defeat of the entire system. The Mamluks were more successful when they resorted to guerrilla techniques. As you can understand, their superb horses made them elusive, and the desert was an inviolable sanctuary. But there is also nothing in the desert. So the fact that they were pushed there means, as we've explained countless times, politically, strategically, that you're at the out. You have already lost practically. You're at the outskirts of the centers of power, and yes, on the longer run you can make it, but still for reasons that have been not reversible on the broader scale that in some given moments. So French ingenuity, by the way, found a countermeasure to Mamluk guerrilla as well. And especially commanders such as Louis Desé exploited it very skillfully. That is, they made mobile columns mounted on dromedaries. And this animal is capable of long pursuits in the desert. As you know, impossible with other means at the time. And the men, coming mainly from the infantry regiments, would fight by dismounting from the dromedary and using the animal as a barricade, which is interesting because we're just talking the other day about the Mongol logistics and the fact that by fighting against the Mamluks at some point they dismounted themselves and used the horses as a barricade. So these are pretty practical, but sometimes very standard and practical logics in this context. And this new French unit was not equipped with special uniforms, but soon adopted the more practical local clothing, which naturally was much better suited for the desert. So much so that these French troops would become practically indistinguishable from the Mamluks. Even the saber was abandoned for the curved and very sharp Mamluk scimitar. This is very interesting because naturally there is a similarity in the whole concept, but the adaptation capacity of still essentially professional soldiers like the French were in these mass, not just levies, but also prolonged service in such campaigns would make them, right? In any case, French superiority led in this courageous infantry and its devastating firepower and drill and discipline and in fact also adaptational capacity, their organization, their logistics that allowed also more artillery to be fielded. There were instances where the Mamluks brought on the field cannons of their own, something much more, vintage, let's say, and reduced in number, and to try to shatter the French squares. But French cavalry would be able to charge into this multitude of Mamluk horsemen, reach the cannons, and essentially take them out of service entirely. So this shows how it's not even the technique, it's properly, again, as always, von Clausewitz explains, moral superiority. Right, so even the same skills that a Mamluk could have individually, at the end of the day, didn't match what the collective effectiveness of their units formations could afford, tactically speaking. So this tells a lot, and tells a lot also about the dramatic equestrian culture that Europeans had, even though they weren't definitely cavalry-based armies. And this speaks of volumes of the force of the broader system and the broader civilization. Now, after the Battle of Cairo, the Battle of Pyramids, Napoleon had a few days to enjoy such victory. And it's interesting to look at the psyche of the man. There are very interesting scripts by Napoleon that he wrote as a sort of diary about during all his time. And a very personal concern came to disturb him deeply, right, to the point of embittering his existence and hardening his character. And it's quite relatable one, because learning on July the 25th of the betrayal of his own wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, who naturally had remained in Paris, differently, however, as we'll see now, from other French noble women, the deeply in love Bonaparte fell into a deep depression. And not only this, a few more days after, on August the 1st, Admiral Horatio Nelson attacked the French fleet by surprise, despite it being anchored in a strong defensive position in the Aboukir Bay, completely destroying it and gaining for Britain an unquestionable naval superiority also in the Mediterranean. Now, the defeat severed the links between the Armée d'Orient and the motherland, condemning the fate simply of the whole Egyptian campaign, right? Because without constant supplies from France, the army in Egypt couldn't really do anything. It would have been essentially worn out slowly, right? Cooking literally within Egypt itself, as it happened to the final end, right? So imagine you are Napoleon, your wife has betrayed you. Basically, this entire expedition that you have committed your entire political character in front of the French, of the Directory, and all the hoax that want to tear yourself apart, comes, and you're devastated, right? And while it is true, of course, that the Egyptian campaign would cast a leaden shadow on the future of the Napoleonic epic, still, we must appreciate the fact that in this depressive mode, Napoleon showed, as always, this leonine, moral giantism, to say the least. I mean, he accepted it. He said, basically, well, don't worry about this. Let's go on with the campaign, right? And he did. And this is something extraordinary that naturally he knew was to be played very carefully and well, but just imagine to have been shattered literally by these two events, and what's the moral burden of the entire thing, right? Contrarily to what all the populistic bullshit of the myth of the butchers and so on, generals in wars are the ones that have the, by far and incomparably, the greatest pain of anybody, including those who are disemboweled on the battlefield. That is to say, they have the entire moral burden of having not just those people dying, but literally, having all the political implications of this on their shoulders. Something enormous, gigantic, titanic. If you don't have a megalopsychia, you cannot be a commander. Napoleon in this proved all of it, and in this sense, the rest of the campaign has to be analyzed importantly on the base of this. There is naturally, these are very well documented events, considering the times and places much closer to us in many ways than what we mostly discuss in medieval history. And naturally, there are things that we don't know, but there is a very interesting part of the Egyptian expedition. It has to do with the relation with the population, like properly the slogans, the announcements, the speeches of Napoleon, of the French occupation force towards the Egyptians. And the phase was always that Allah was protecting them, that the French were winning, and that they were fighting against this terribly corrupt Mamluk Ottoman elite that had oppressed the population. And the thing went on and on and on, even though, as we will see, the French also carried out large massacres in response to Egyptian uprisings. And the thing was definitely pretty tense with Britain and the Ottomans working to take the French out, and knowing from the other side that, in fact, the entire expedition was doomed, as a matter of fact, because of the destruction of the French fleet at Aboukir. And this is the point. Napoleon was able to react, demonstrating, and there was a big need at that point, all his charisma. Remember, he had made this terrific Italian campaign, which he had demonstrated really what he was worth, but this is before his actual rise to power. The same directory, as we've seen, had sent him to Egypt exactly hoping to, not just him to stay away for a long time, probably to fail, so to get rid of him for good. And Napoleon's survival politically, but also probably from a biological point of view, was deeply connected with what he could do in Egypt. Naturally, he had many connections in France, including, his family had managed at that point to enter importantly in politics and would support him, as we will see in the end, decisively. But still, again, what was done in this campaign in Syria also was the attempt to reinforce all of his reputation. As we were saying before, Napoleon managed not only to convince by minimizing the extent of the Al-Bukir disaster, but above all, in the very skilled mobilization of the energies of his men on future objectives. Because you can't even lie, but if people, generally speaking, understand what is going on, that's going to be pretty demoralizing. Naturally, there were many cards to play in the region, right, that could bring in the brightest of possibilities to some interesting situation. But let's say that was not a theater where the general could spark as much as it had been done in the previous year in Europe, and later events would in fact so prove this. Now, in the following months, the French divided their efforts between military actions against the Mamluks in the south of Egypt and the Ottomans in Syria. And of course, in parts, some Mamluks had taken refuge in the latter under Ottoman protection and so on. So we say Syria, but we're actually talking about Palestine, about Lebanon, and so consider the Ottomans had reconciled themselves with the Mamluks, given that now the French were a common enemy. So this troubled Egyptian issue was somewhat now, yes, of course, it had transformed into a French one, but still many Mamluk refugees would boost the Ottoman reaction that was naturally coordinated with the British and so on. It was important to invade Syria, especially certain ports like Jaffa and so on, because opening multiple ports could ease the logistical situation of the French army, right? So they could split the routes, and so the Royal Navy, as a consequence as well, to prevent supplies reaching Napoleon. So there were some Pyrrhic victories in Syria. Some were successes of important strategic measure, but the French army stopped at the siege of Acre. It was defended by some of the newly reformed Ottoman military elite corps, plus the British that supplied the fortress from the sea as well. So the French essentially stopped there and they came back to Egypt. And the broader actions against the Ottomans also on other fronts didn't have an immediate success either, but they were also secondary. France at this point not only intended to occupy Egypt, but also felt the need to export her revolutionary ideals of freedom and progress among the poor Egyptian peasants, the aforementioned fellahin. The presence in the expedition of the the aforementioned 167 savants, so scientists and men of culture, skillfully coordinated by the mathematician Gaspard Monge, was a tribute to Enlightenment culture, a propaganda move, and a think tank as well at Napoleon's disposal. Because you had to understand the local culture if you wanted to, to win their favor, of course. So this man, so not strictly of politics or war, but of books and of knowledge were quite useful. Now, little loved and even less helped by the military, however, they did not get the desired results, because surely these were literates, scholars that had, first of all, their own broader intellectual and personal interests, and that just secondarily cared about the military, that had other logics and so on. So this brought to internal problems and naturally disappointing the same local population sympathy, let's say, because, for example, communications in Arabic were so poor in general as to raise even hilarity and irritation in the people. Like they knew this French didn't understand anything basically about what they said, and vice versa. So what actually was more successful was the spread of, say, some conquests of Western culture through the foundation of the so-called Institute of Egypt, right? And it was under its impulse that, for example, the most efficient European printing presses were introduced in Egypt, with a great impact on the culture of the country and, as a consequence, also of the entire Arab world. Even for the West, however, the presence of the savant proved to be fertile. We have mentioned the Rosetta Stone, that alone, just because of the synopsis of hieroglyphic and demotic scripts for ancient Egyptian and an ancient Greek script, is one of the greatest finds in the history of mankind for our understanding of ancient Egyptian history and civilization, and so on. This was found by the genius officer Pierre Bouchard, right? So, through this, through discoveries that at some point were also relatively random, right? Napoleon, for example, discovered some important tombs while working at, say, the possibility of opening the Suez, what would become effectively the Suez Canal later on, there was a general impression that these discoveries made already at the time in the European public opinion, that, as you know, since the 18th century, industrialization and mass literacy had been increasing, becoming an important part of Western culture, and this brought to the science of Egyptology in France, with the first series of publications collected in the series titled Description de l'Égypte, and opened its own art and culture to the entire West. Napoleon had considered, as we were saying, the cultural and religious implications of the conflict. The French troops were ordered to respect the Muslim religion and local customs with repeated recommendations. The savants did their best to broaden their knowledge of those regions, just in a very anthropological way, not just of the past Egypt, but also of their present one, and obtained remarkable results also in this side of the story. However, the experts' command of the Arabic language was so poor, as we've seen, that the local population greeted Napoleon's proclamations and edicts with hilarity, and frustration in general. It was the general contrast that we highlighted before, more between a much more modern and secularized European mindset, but also a quite more successful and aggressive and somewhat, in fact, morally driven one, than this more stagnant, traditionalistic and inefficient system that puts. I would like to leave you with this concept properly. That puts in parallel the different levels in which modernity and tradition can interact, right? Don't think that traditional societies are by default provided by enough moral force to be better than a modern one. It doesn't happen like that. It has, as a matter of fact, nothing to do with that, right? In this sense, Europe and the West was driven by much more traditional ideas, even though at the time they were properly already not forgotten as such, but at least they poured into this modernity in a way that this modernity was not so concerned about, at least by the most extremistic Jacobin ideas, right? This aspect is dramatically important because it encompasses a little bit the entire politics of the Napoleonic era, and Napoleon was aware of that. Like, for example, the juridical model of the state as the only source of law issued with the Code Napoleon after centuries of avocations, right? That the absolute monarchies that weren't absolute at all in that sense were just negotiating with the communities to in fact acquire ever more centralized power, could be spread in countries like France, like Italy, even already in the Rhineland. Napoleon left in part some kind of a hybrid between the older juridical system of, in fact, of the Ancien Regime and the and this kind of some novelties, this kind of rationalization, uniformation of code. So every country has its own pace, but again, when we look at great forces in history, these were always provided with power, because in traditional view, evil doesn't have power, right? The power of evil is actually the idleness, is the idea that you don't have the force to react. So you can even claim that you're a traditionalist, but if you don't achieve anything, like from a cultural point of view, you're not superior to a more modern world that maybe, again, has rationalized too much and even denies the past, but is actually still living with a strong traditional power within it. And this, in my opinion, is also a bit the beautiful synchrosis that made also the same Prussian culture with von Clausewitz, that understood the superiority of the modern elements that the French Revolution had brought in warfare, but at the same time was able to visualize also properly from an anthropological point of view, the necessity of the virtus still, right? This is a bit like the same paradox, but that it can be very instructive between the Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks had pioneered reason, and Thucydides, in one passage of the War of the Peloponnese, states that basically discipline is everything, and if you just follow orders, you will always win, without any virtue, any form of individualism. The Romans, for example, were completely alien to this idea. They were even more brutally disciplined than the Greeks, but they never denied that discipline had to coexist with a virtus, with a kind of warrior ethos, because without the two things, you cannot have any, that superiority of military culture that brought Rome to take over not just Greece, but the entire world. So the French in the Napoleonic Wars were a bit like this. France, as we've explained very often also in the medieval history lessons, was by far the single most radical imperialistic, and still is, by the way, power in the West, and by DNA, like the genetics of French culture lay deeply in that since Clovis, and also the context in which Clovis emerged. And this brought, paradoxically, the French state to expand faster than any other to the point that it also arrived to that kind of breaking point earlier than any other with the French Revolution and so on. And so needing this further step, that however is a product of that push, not of a sort of soul degeneration, right? The degeneration could be formal, could be in the unsustainability of the system, but still that system had a power on its own that managed almost to take over the entire Europe. And that is something that you can see much before, also historically speaking, at different times when France was properly united politically and could pose that threat to the entire continent. So this this order of ideas, in my opinion, is crucial, because it's too easy to make the comparison. The Napoleonic ideas were bad, so the entire package was just rotten. No, it can't be seen like that. It's a deep political, strategic, moral, and scientific mistake to reason along those patterns, right? There is no pride in just saying, but I was different, so I was better. What did you actually do at that point, right? Did you do what France did? Because nobody did what France did in that moment. So, and France eventually came back a bit into that dimension. As you know, after the Restoration, nothing was like before. Not even in countries where there hadn't been a revolution. Things were not before, like in Austria, in Russia, in Germany, in Italy, in Britain, in Spain. So pretty much everywhere, this wave had shocked the entire system. And some of these moments, in fact, are also the highest of human civilization. In fact, consider von Clausewitz in that context, right? So it's all intertwined, right? People who think only about their own countries because they literally know nothing about it and never did, and likely never will, statistically speak. In any case, speaking of the strained relations between the French and the Egyptians, despite this broader commitment, the local Islamic population was hostile towards French occupation, and since in this sense the French had failed to use the carrot to use, let's say, good manners, they resolutely resorted to the stick. As I was saying before, force, brutality doesn't mean barbarity, right? The French, in that sense, knew how to have an empire and displayed that to the full effect. A revolt that broke out in Cairo itself in October 1798 and spread quickly in the rest of the country was repressed with such harshness as to discourage any attempt to try again. The French were in deep trouble, by the way, because the city, the capital, began to properly to rise. These bands supported by the Mamluks and began to erect barricades in the streets to surround. Napoleon was someone that had, as you know, fired mitraille on the royalists that were about to literally smashing the heads of his own men in the streets in the French capital. This man had coped with the revolution, right? The French Revolution, again, a huge giant. Napoleon placed cannons on the citadel of Cairo, began to fire against the quarters that where the rebels were located. They sent the French infantry in the streets, and this began to raze to the ground the barricades, to shoot, to kill, to massacre. And Napoleon managed to corner the hotbed of the rebellion into the famous Al-Azhar mosque, and he rapidly said, "He, that is God, is too late. You have begun. Now I will finish it." And the French shot with cannons against the mosque, that they broke it. They swarmed in and they slaughtered the hell out of those who had taken refuge inside. Everyone, by the way, because there were also civilians, whatever. This proved what the French were capable of, and that's how you objectively handle a rebellion. This was enough in fact, to stop any other attempt of revolt later on, right? So even in street fighting, the French had proven to be the greater force. So once the situation had normalized with such gentle means, Napoleon found the time and desire to console himself for his wife's betrayal. You know that Napoleon, had quite a taste for women, or at least, just a bulimia of some sort. And he's quite open about it in his diaries. And so, consider how life was really at the time. Despite even express prohibition, some French officers had managed to embark their wives or mistresses. This was, in some other context, always kind of normal. Among these, there was the officer of the dragoons, Jean-Noël Furet, who had taken his wife, Pauline Belle-Île, with him, in a sort of continuation of the honeymoon, by the way, disguised in a hunter's uniform, by the way. And Pauline was brilliant, petite, and with a splendid smile. She was young, and by the way, she was the most admired dame at the social gatherings. And this provoked the ire of her husband, because he was dramatically jealous, and he was considered too violent and quick to anger, even according to the broad parameters of the French officers that definitely were not particularly cold-blooded people, aside of, when they had to exterminate large amounts of them. So Napoleon fell in love with Pauline at first sight and courted her with discretion, at least, considering the problem of this husband of hers. And in fact, this was immediately reciprocated with equal prudence by the girl. And it was clear to both of them that nothing could begin, in fact, between them as long as the abusive dragoon was present in Egypt. And on December the 17th, 1798, the officer was, this is how it happened, he was summoned on a mission that required immediate departure for Paris. And that same evening, at a reception, Pauline became what the troop dubbed Napoleon's Cleopatra and Generaless, which definitely fit the context. However, the Royal Navy, that never slept, reserved an unpleasant surprise for the lovers. In fact, having captured the husband of Pauline along the crossing, the British had him sent back to the sender. So, given the suspected uselessness of the dispatches that they had found he was carrying, and he looked for a wife, he announced that she had abandoned him. He slapped her. They divorced. And so finally Pauline returned to Napoleon's side, always greeted, by the way, by the ovations of the soldiers, among whom she was very popular. So this was a way in which Napoleon consoled himself after Josephine's betrayal, and he regained thus his serenity, at least as far as the sentimental side of the story was, because as we've seen, for the rest, Egypt was somewhat messy enough. In fact, the success of the expedition would have not depended on this relationship. Napoleon could face any hostile human act. As we know, he had the entire world against him. But he could do nothing against the latest and most devastating plague that had broken out in Egypt, right? Probably the bubonic one. The French ranks that were already sorely tried by the fighting, the climate, and other endemic diseases, by the way, in Egypt, in the Near East, were further decimated by the terrible plague. Right, at the siege of Acre, this had already struck the French army, and when they retreated south, the column marched with the plagued soldiers in the rear of the army, so that they wouldn't infect, hopefully, the rest. And this was the trail of the army that was targeted by the Ottomans that were chasing them. And the Ottomans who took this, in general, any French prisoner, they made him do pretty terrible end. And even more that displagued ones, also they were easy prey in that context. There are also some kind of darkly humorous episodes. For example, there was a French soldier that had managed to escape Ottoman prison, and he came to Napoleon in tears, because he said basically that when the Ottomans had captured him, they had raped him in rotation, and so now he wanted to kill himself, because in his unit everybody laughed about him and called him like a woman and all these things. And Napoleon, this is just telling you a bit the kind of the man Napoleon. I mean, honor was a very important thing. You have seen it with Furet and his wife, and it was a big deal even among the soldiers, the peasantry. Speaking of tradition, as we were saying before, living even among the uncultivated masses. A man is a man, right? It would have been better to die, and that's why he would have killed himself rather than living with this shame of having been raped by the Ottomans. Napoleon, in this sense, perhaps he did embody the idea of the better of modernity, because he laughed at him. Like, just imagine the guy who had come to this semi-divine figure now, especially that he had entered Egypt like Alexander. He made triumphal arcs everywhere, and the guy laughs at him, and he actually told him something fair. That is to say, instead of whining about this, be content that you actually survived prison. Unlike many other of our comrades, had made a much bitter end with the Ottomans, and I don't think we know what happened to the guy eventually, but it's just kind of a terrifying anecdote. And yes, these things, by the way, were the thing, but ritual rape in the French army seemingly was something very, very common up to relatively recent times. So here we're talking about, I already told you, what the Gaelic Fiannas or the Germanic Comitatus were about, right? And these things were living so much still in those times. I mean, when you entered the army, you were destroyed as a human being and reformed as a killing machine, which entailed that you had to be abused psychophysically in the worst possible imaginable ways and taught to obey without even thinking that your opinion has any form of value, until you had to prove that on the battlefield. And so these things are real, right? Again, we look at the Napoleonic era as like, our modernity and all the myth behind it, but reason on the fact that still, I made videos about this aspect, even in the clothing, properly in the meaning, in the symbols that were used on the battlefields at the time. It was a brutally archaic time in history, with radically traditional meanings everywhere, warriorhood, and again, they were brutally framed under the collective discipline that was by far the thing that made this system superior in any way. So the warrior was, as we've seen with the Mamluk, was buried far behind in Western civilization. But still, as I was saying before, in the comparison between the Greeks and the Romans, the idea that even in the broader collective discipline, you have to be made of steel to be even a fantassin that stands under musketry fire for hours with people dying around you and just like a Russian roulette. Well, these are things that need a massive individual strength and belief and hardcore values, right? So that tells you in comparison how much bigger, even civilizationally speaking, collective discipline is from a military point of view to emerge over already this pretty tough kind of warrior system and basically annihilating it for how superior the former really is. So that's, again, yet another scale of how the history of humanity, in my opinion, true warfare, by the way, can be profitably studied and analyzed. So although after a year of occupation, Napoleon emerged victorious in every battle he fought in Egypt and as in Syria, except for the abandoned siege of Acre, he was now convinced that his enterprise was doomed to failure. Because time had come, right? The system was being worn out irreparably, and you can't really build it from scratch in those conditions. So in 1799, there was also a broader drama for the French armies in Europe because of the counterattack of the combined forces of the Second Coalition armies, led by the able Russian general Alexander Suvorov. The Russians entered Milan. It was like a pretty serious situation that brought the French to lose practically all their previous gains. So this was a very grave moment where properly of course the army of the East was completely forgotten. Right here, France risked to crumble, and thus Napoleon's failure in general in the campaign of Egypt seemed just irrelevant, and that's where the man could come back undefeated, because he was undefeated at that point, to France and exploit the situation. Of course, this entailed, as it would happen, to leave the Armée d'Orient behind. Naturally, there was still a problem in making Napoleon passing for a victor while returning home without being won, right? He was undefeated, but he wasn't a victor either. And so, resuming his career in a continent that, however, was undoubtedly more congenial to him. So, taking advantage of the fact that the inevitable defeat of the expedition was still far away, because the Ottomans, also the British, hadn't been so daring up to that point. With exceptional timing, Bonaparte handed over the command of Egypt to General Jean-Baptiste Kléber and embarked for France on August the 23rd, 1799, on the frigate Muron, abandoning de facto his men without regret to their unhappy fate that was awaiting for them. And Napoleon abandoned also Pauline, by the way, but he brought with him instead to Europe a new valet destined to become his picturesque shadow for the next 15 years. It was the Mamluk Rustam Razan. And Rustam was, this gives you an idea of probably also the Mamluks kind of were, was an Armenian, kidnapped at a very young age, so in the full Mamluk tradition, to serve in Egypt. And with his exotic attire, he attracted at least as much as attention as his master at some point. You know, that Europeans had this kind of, they had the mirabilia at court, like the midgets, the black, this kind of things. And this man would be faithful to Napoleon, but not to the end. In fact, Rustam refused to follow him into exile on Elba, causing lasting resentment in Napoleon at that point. And this was punctually recorded in the Empereur memoirs. This was far to come, naturally, and at home that he reached crossing the Mediterranean without problems. Some even say maybe he contracted this with the British in some way because maybe the British, saw him as an important political pawn to spend in France, maybe even trying to negotiate some royalist comeback. There's a lot of talk about this. I don't think it was the case, but at least the behavior of some British officer that was blockading Egypt in the circumstance Napoleon's ship managed to cross the blockade is worth considering historically. In any case, on that occasion, Bonaparte had set only the proclamations of his victories. He came back to France with this palms of victory, from Egypt as a symbol of triumph and so on, in a classical fashion that was so, in fact, popular at the time. Objectively, he had won again many times in Egypt, and naturally, nothing that let the real state of the situation leak out was propagated, because Egypt was about to fall. Right, the inevitable failure of the expedition was imminent, under especially, in fact, as we will see now, the Ottoman and British pressure. Napoleon's return was therefore welcomed by the French, thanks to this skillful propaganda, as the providential act of responsibility of the only man that in that critical situation with enemy armies at the gates of France could protect the country against any new aggression of her enemies. The poor Kleber, that was kind of a sensitive individual and had taken Napoleon's place after all the big shot that he had carried out, was assassinated, famously enough, at the hands of a killer, a theology student of the Al-Azhar University. He was of Syrian origin. He basically approached the French general acting as a beggar, right? And then he grabbed the hand that Kleber had offered him for a kiss of homage, and took the general's body and stabbed him with a dagger 4 times, one at the heart, one at the chest, one at the forearm, and one at the thigh. And Kleber died. The assassin was captured and then punished after a summary trial in a way that certainly did not correspond to a particularly civilized idea of Western progress, at least from the juridical intuitions of the time. That is to say, the hand that had gripped the weapon was burned to the bone. Right, the guy had his hand burned to the bone when he was alive, and then he was simply impaled, right, to make the long story short. So kind of tells about the tenderness of the times, but don't think that today is much different. And this, in a sense, shows, of course, this was a punishment that conformed also to the typical local customs and folklore of the land, but at the same time was, from the French side, a well-deserved end, because kind of was a deceiving one, a treacherous one. And yet we should point out that some Egyptian thinkers at the time that had also sided with the French, so in that sense we're a bit biased, but at least they said yes, the French were kind of, because of course the French were too progressive for Egyptian ideas, and so local thinkers that supported Napoleonic cause, as we've seen, for different reasons politically, were trying to say give the devil its due, and essentially pointing out that there were some positive things the French did, and also from an Egyptian perspective, such as, for example, the idea of having a fair trial, which was, well established at that point in the legal practice and culture. Naturally, the assassination of Kleber brought to an extra, to to an exception to that, and of course the French, as the Egyptians, covered themselves with as any other worst of the worst massacres around there, and still suspect that the French were still somewhat more civilized. But in fact, we're talking about the mess of a country that is about to collapse with the comeback of the Mamluk establishment, the advance of the Ottomans and the British, and we've seen how also the Ottomans detested the Egyptians, and plus in this still in fact military situation against the French, and the whole thing was pretty messed up. In fact, when Clebert died, the role of scapegoat for the failure of the expedition, which cost the lives of those 30,000 French, became not him, but his successor. It was General Jacques-François Menou, because he was the one who was eventually forced to surrender at the siege of Alexandria, under the Anglo-Ottoman army at the siege of Alexandria. That concluded the French adventure. It's important to understand how the Egyptian expedition played for French internal politics that actually smiled to Napoleon, as you know. Because at that point, the plans of the Directory to get rid of Napoleon had failed miserably. In the face of his qualities as a propagandist of himself, and for the small Corsican, the road of power was now downhill. The recent elections had showed that the Jacobin power that was very critical of the Directory at that point was on the rise. So Napoleon exploited this threat, let's say, to justify a coup, the coup that would bring him to de facto power. In fact, an often overlooked aspect of Napoleon's rise is the importance of his family. Perhaps the most decisive role was played, in fact, by his brother Luciano, and precisely in the most critical moment that the general found himself facing. It was his appointment as first consul, thanks to the coup d'etat of 18 Brumaire, that would be actually November the 9th, 1799, orchestrated by Lucien. In fact, Lucien and Napoleon, of course, managed to convince the 5 members of the Directory of an imminent Jacobin coup, which was a credible threat in that condition, considered that there had already been some coups. The same Directory had essentially infringed the constitution multiple times and consolidated power. This was in fact reproached by the same Napoleon, who was said in the room, you broke the constitution thrice. Nobody even believes in you or the same constitution at the same time. So this anymore. So this shows you how weak, after all, the French government had become, especially under new external pressure that endangered the entire country. And so Napoleon and Lucien invented this coup by saying, essentially, Lucien stated the threat and said that the Directory would have been safer in a castle there in Paris, protected by the troops of his brother Napoleon. Thus, locked up, 3 of the 5 directors preferred to resign from their position, thus leaving France without a guide. And in the meantime, Napoleon was militarily occupying the 2 branches of the French Parliament with his grenadiers, the Council of the Elders and the Council of 500. And however, the opposition in this last chamber, of which Lucien himself was president, was ferocious, right? And there was no way, even at that point, apparently, even against the threat of force, to change the situation. So much so that Napoleon was aggressed. By the way, he himself lost heart. Apparently he was about to pass out. Pale and dumbfounded by the vehemence of his opponents, he was saved by Lucien, who pointed his sword at his own brother, and addressing the assembly, declared himself ready to pierce him in the heart immediately if he had suspected him of treason towards France. And that show, also with a bit of force, essentially brought to the dismissal of the council, whose members continued to protest, but eventually were carried away. They were essentially brought to give up, because objectively now the entire parliament, as you understand, had been seized. And so within hours, Napoleon was proclaimed first consul. And then lots of things, of course, happened later, but for today, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.